Buenos días a todos. Welcome to everyone.
Yeah, Mariano.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Buen día. Buen día, Guido.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to everyone.
Good afternoon,
Those
yeah.
who are in afternoon, we are in morning.
afternoon.
Here is morning in the south.
Good afternoon, Kitty. I see Kitty.
Hi.
Oh, that's Kitty.
Laela.
And Viviana.
I'm Kitty.
And I already said hello
Viviana,
to
Pablo.
Pablo.
Nice to
Good morning.
meet you.
Hi, Kitty.
Les pedimos que a medida que saluden, si gustan, o lo manden al chat, vayan silenciando los micrófonos. We ask you to turn off your microphones, your mics, so we can begin with the conference of the morning. Pablo, ¿te parece que demos comienzo? Mientras
Sí,
tanto,
por
si
favor.
va entrando
Sí,
gente.
sí. Damos comienzo.
Bien, bien. Bueno, es un gran placer iniciar esta segunda jornada con otra de nuestras conferencias de gente que se ha vuelto muy querida para nuestro espacio en la biblioteca y que nos ha acompañado este tiempo, que es Laela Zwollo, que va a continuar un poco con la línea que vinimos trabajando ayer en las conferencias. Como verán, está organizado todo para ir siguiendo una línea de análisis, así que nos complace muchísimo recibirla a la doctora Laela Zwollo, que es investigadora postdoctoral en la Escuela de Teología de Tilburg y es miembro del Netherlands Center of Early Christian Studies. El supervisor de su tesis doctoral fue el doctor Paul Van Gist, a quien escuchamos ayer por la mañana, que abordó en su tesis el tratamiento que Agustín le da a Porfirio en la Ciudad de Dios. Laela vive en Lelystad y es autora de St. Augustine and Plotinus, The Human Mind as Image of the Divine, San Agustín y Plotino, La mente humana como imagen de lo divino, editado por Brill en el año 2018. Y la presentación de Laela que tenemos para hoy se titula Mary Magdalene's Tears in Augustine's Corrections of the Philosophers. Así que, Laela, es un gran honor tenerte entre nosotros y te escuchamos atentamente.
Gracias, Mariano. Paul van Geest dijo ayer que quisiera mejorar mi vida en el futuro por mejorar mi castellano. Y así es mi deseo también, porque mi exposición hoy estará en el inglés. Pero quizás la próxima vez, la próxima conferencia, quién sabe. Estoy muy agradecida por esta invitación a participar en este evento maravilloso. Sobre todo, agradezco a Pablo y Mariano. Es un honor muy, muy grande para mí. And now I'm going to switch to English and even switch my place. Just one moment. Here we go. In antique literature, Mary Magdalene was portrayed by Christians and non-Christians in a variety of ways. Next slide, Mariano. My lecture will concentrate on Augustine's interpretation of Mary Magdalene in two works, the homilies on the Gospel of John and the City of God, Book 14. Yet I will show how Augustine in the City of God 14 had the philosophers Celsus and Porphyry in mind. In particular, their critique of Mary Magdalene. In late antiquity, Christian devotion was severely criticized by these two prominent Platonist. Both attacked the Christian conception of the incarnation of a God. And in Platonism, God was, by definition, completely immaterial. Thus, the notion of a God who lived as a human being with a normal physical body was considered absurd. Not to mention the notion of the corporal resurrection of this same God, as well as the Christian hope to be resuscitated in the flesh sometime after death. The resurrection could be attacked from many other different angles, but these two Platonists discovered another outlet, the person of Mary Magdalene, who in John 20 was the first to see the risen Christ and the first to announce this news to the disciples. Next slide, please, Mariano. Celsus and Porphyry, in their zeal to argue against the accuracy of the resurrection stories, discredited Mary Magdalene as a credible witness. Celsus portrayed her as hysterical and deluded, and I quote, "Who really saw his rising from the dead? An hysterical woman, deluded by Jesus' sorcery, or perhaps so wrenched with grief at his failure that they hallucinated him risen from the dead by a sort of wishful thinking." Porphyry's depiction of Mary Magdalene is similar, yet he mentions nothing about tears or emotions. What he does say is this, I quote, "Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene, a prostitute who came from some horrible little village and had been possessed by 7 demons, and another Mary, equally unknown, probably a peasant woman, and others who were of no account." So Porphyry's degrading image of Mary Magdalene meant that Mary Magdalene was, as a person, not dignified enough to have been the first witness of the risen God. Because why didn't Jesus appear to Pontius Pilate or Herod or to the high priest of the Jewish people or even a Roman senator? Celsus and Porphyry's anti-Christian polemic elicited the responses of a number of Christian intellectuals who sought to rectify the blatant misinterpretation of the resurrection of Christ. And in doing so, they explained the details of the New Testament sequences, making more sense of the person of Mary Magdalene as witness to the resurrection. Next slide. Augustine mentions Mary Magdalene in a number of works. Yet my lecture will focus on these two, which have the greatest theological import and are richest in content. We'll first begin with the homilies, because then we can see how Augustine builds on certain points later in his exegesis in the City of God. In the homilies, chapter 121, Augustine analyzes the scene of Mary Magdalene discovering the risen Christ. And I've chosen 6 examples of elements in Augustine's interpretation to illustrate how he enriched the original gospel context, thus portraying her personage in a positive manner. Next slide, please. In the first example, Augustine depicts Mary Magdalene as honored to be the first to see Jesus after his resurrection because of her womanly emotional strength and her love. And he asked, what do her emotions mean? And he finds the answer in my second and third examples, when he asked what it was that impelled her to look into Jesus' empty grave. Augustine assumes that it was a divine impulse, implying Mary Magdalene's strong connection to God. Next slide. The third example has to do with Mary Magdalene's reply when the angels asked her why she was weeping. And she says, because they have taken away my Lord. Augustine points out that she's calling Christ's dead body her Lord, which was in effect an act of calling a part, which stands for the whole, a figure of speech in Latin, aparte totum. The flesh, as terrestrial and mortal, stands for the whole human being. So Augustine doesn't dwell on this expression in the homilies, yet he does in the City of God, which I'll discuss later. Next slide. The fourth example has to do with Mary Magdalene mistaking Christ for the gardener, calling him Sir, Domine. And directly thereafter, she recognized Christ and the fact that he had risen, and then calls him Master, Rabboni. Augustine sees this change in vocative as a change in insight, and Mary Magdalene's conversion from bodily things, in which divine reality is misunderstood, to a change of heart and an understanding of divine matters. In recognizing Christ, she was recalling the teacher of whom she was learning to discern things, human from divine. Next slide. In the fifth example, Augustine plays with the idea of Christ as gardener. And he says, the transformation of Mary's perception of reality in recognizing the risen Christ had been instigated by Christ himself, who had sown these things into her heart as the gardener of her soul. And I quote, for Jesus was giving a lesson in faith to the woman, and this gardener was sowing in her heart, as in his own garden, the grain of a mustard seed. So what Christ was sowing in her heart, Augustine explains, was a non-carnal understanding of Christ, the Son who was equal to the Father, who had incarnated into a human body, and in fact risen from the dead, a truth which can only be embraced by faith. And even for Mary Magdalene, who is standing right before Christ. And he clarifies this in my sixth example. Next slide, please. Augustine explores Jesus' words, do not touch me, and asserts that some sacred mystery, a sacramentum, must lie hidden in these words. And he adds that others did touch Jesus physically after his resurrection, such as Thomas. And then he revokes the idea that Mary Magdalene was not to touch him because she was a woman. So apparently there were theologians in antiquity who believed this. But then Augustine proceeds to dig deeper into what this mystery means. And I quote, in this way, Christ wished himself to be believed, to be touched spiritually, that he and the Father are one, to the inward perception of a person who has made such progress in the knowledge of Christ. So Augustine's designation of Jesus' famous words, noli me tangere, as a sacrament or mystery, is directly connected to his depiction of the transformation of Mary Magdalene's spirit, her conversion, and her arrival to spiritual truth. Her tears of sorrow, her faulty perception, and the lack of understanding of divine mysteries, these were all carnal perceptions. And later, she changes her orientation. She perceives the divine mystery of the resurrected Christ and experiences joy. Augustine intended this joy to be understood as a sacramentum, as a transformation of the soul. Hence, Jesus forbade Mary to touch or regard him through her limited physical perception. Next slide, please. And now we turn to the city of God. And in this part of my lecture, a number of themes of Book 14 will be discussed. After mentioning Mary Magdalene and parte totum, Augustine gives an exposition on the flesh and the spirit. And then his exposition turns to the topics of sin and emotions. And in this context, the critique of Mary Magdalene by Celsus and Porphyry become relevant. Augustine then deals with specific philosophical conceptions of emotions, such as Virgil's and the Stoic notion of apatheia. And again, Augustine seems to have Celsus and Porphyry's critique of Mary Magdalene in mind when he makes important statements on Christian emotions and those of Jesus. In Book 14, Mary Magdalene is mentioned only once, yet the passage itself is pregnant with significance and connected to a number of broader theological themes. His treatment is also much more complicated, and of course, that's more interesting for us. So in one of my examples from homilies, Augustine symbolically identified Mary Magdalene with the carnal because she was weeping for Christ's dead body, which she couldn't see, due to a mental orientation associated with flesh. And he said that this orientation is similar to the figure of speech, a part which stands for the whole. So now in the city of God, he mentions a parte totum, alongside Mary Magdalene in the same breath, as it were. And this topos will kick off a highly technical study of flesh and spirit, which will continue through Book 14. You can read about the details in my paper, but for now, I'll just give a brief resume and a drastic simplification of his conclusions. The point of his discourse in the City of God 14 is the following. Although there seems to be a tidy dichotomy between the meaning of flesh and spirit, the flesh referring to the lower perception, the spirit to the higher, as we saw in the homilies, this dichotomy does not truly hold water. It would seem that way, according to Augustine, when we look at St. Paul's identification with vice, with living by the rule of the flesh. Next slide, please, Mariano. Augustine interjects Galatians 5, in which the works of the flesh are associated with a long list of terrible vices. Yet Augustine then points out that many of these vices show faults of the mind and not necessarily faults of the flesh itself. Next slide, please. He relates this to the figure of speech, aparte totum, in which human or human nature is meant by the word flesh. And he shows that this construction often occurs in scripture and provides a most salient example. The word was made flesh. And in this sense, flesh simply means human as a neutral qualification. So Augustine asserts flesh in the neutral sense of standing for a part of the whole actually means the body as an essentially good product of God's creation. Flesh stands for human nature, which is inherently good. And then he mentions Mary Magdalene, who in John 20 spoke only about the flesh of the Christ while looking for the dead Jesus. Augustine differentiates that flesh in itself is not the same thing as living to the rule of the flesh, as in the vices in St. Paul's Galatians, which is to be understood as a detrimental way of life, which also involves the spirit. So Augustine is striving here for a balance between flesh and spirit. And this has to do with his defense of the value of the physical body, which is in turn essential to his defense of Christ's bodily resurrection and the future bodily resurrection of Christians. And who is he defending against? The Platonists, Celsus and Porphyry, among others. It's noteworthy to mention that Augustine is not letting go of the notion of the superiority of the soul over the body, which is, by the way, a Platonist notion. And it's important to note here that Augustine later in the City of God will assert that the future resurrection of humans will involve the whole human being. However, then he'll admit that the body that humans will acquire at the resurrection will be of a spiritual nature, not of real physical flesh. Next slide, please. This more nuanced view in his thinking on flesh and spirit in the City of God 14 shows us that Augustine is assuring his readers that the precedence of the soul and its higher intellectual facilities does not in any way imply a disdain for the body or the world. The disdain for the body and the world was held by many of his opponents, such as Christian heretics, but also Porphyry, whom Augustine alludes to in Book 14. Yet he addresses Porphyry explicitly in other books in the City of God. For example, he quotes Porphyry as the Platonist who advocated the flight from all things corporal. Porphyry's critique of Mary Magdalene and the resurrection plays a role in Book 14, although Porphyry is not mentioned there. Yet the indirect references are plentiful, especially to Augustine's points of critique of Porphyry's philosophy in Book 10. So Porphyry is the chief antagonist and is brought up again in other books in the City of God, in which Augustine confronts Porphyry's negative judgments of Christ and of the resurrection. So now back to the homilies. We recall that Augustine recognized in Mary Magdalene a most ardent emotional temperament and a strong love for Jesus. The Platonist Celsus on the other hand, found that her hysteria made her an unconvincing witness to the resurrection. So it's of interest to point out that Augustine's sole mentioning of Mary Magdalene in the city of God only occurs in chapter 2 of book 14. And book 14 is famous for Augustine's most extensive exposition on human emotions. So it's not coincidental that book 14, chapter 3, he discusses various philosophers who held certain conceptions on emotions. And again, I will be simplifying Augustine's ruminations on this subject. Next slide, please. The first mentioning of emotions involves the Platonist view by the famous poet Virgil, who claims that certain emotions, desire, fear, joy, and grief, are derived from the body, which explains the origin of all sin and moral failings. Now, as we just saw, Augustine refuted the idea that sin was predominantly caused by the flesh. And now he underlines that the spirit or the soul, the will, was more involved in sin than the flesh itself. And we see here that after mentioning Mary Magdalene and a parte totum, Augustine steered his exploration of the relationship of flesh and spirit to the phenomena of emotions, as if he were thinking of his own interpretation of Mary Magdalene in the homilies, that Mary Magdalene's tears were due to her carnal perspective, which led to the misunderstanding of divine matters. So regarded in this way, her tears were in fact derived from a perspective from the flesh. But now in the city of God, Augustine is adding some specifications. Next slide, please. Augustine agrees with Virgil's Platonist view that the body is weighed down by the soul because of the flesh being corruptible. Yet Augustine corrects both the flesh and the spirit, together constituting the human being, can be both good and bad. Yet human nature, also constituting flesh and spirit, is inherently good. So the problem with Virgil's notion, Augustine says, is that the flesh was corrupted by original sin by the spirit, and not the other way around, the way Virgil has it, that flesh caused corruptive emotions. Next slide. Augustine concludes, sin entails living to the rules of the flesh. In other words, living according to human standards. And compared to the standards of God, the standards of humans are naturally less desirable. Yet the standards of humans must be endured. It pertains to the life we're living now in the earthly city. We all are living to the rules of the flesh, and this can refer to the attitudes propagated by the devil, the same vices Paul had stipulated in Galatians, which I just referred to. Next slide. Augustine goes on to explain how the standard of the flesh is synonymous to living according to human standards. It corresponds to an exclusively physical perception or a material orientation. This was not only had by certain philosophers, such as the Stoics, but also represents the original misconception of Mary Magdalene when weeping. looking for Jesus' dead body while he was standing before her all alone, as we saw in the homilies. Augustine's insistence that the origin of sin derives in the human soul or the will is also of importance to Mary Magdalene's conversion in the homilies. He mentions this conversion of the will often in Book 14, turning to the immaterial God away from material or worldly matters. This was an act of a good functioning will, the first step towards redemption, and it involved recognizing one's personal faults and shortcomings, one's sins, and confessing them to Christ. Next slide. Having established that the origin of evil and sin was not in human flesh, Augustine will go on to show how emotions play in the inner life of the soul and in sin. In chapter 8 of Book 14, he'll nuance his conclusion from the homilies that Mary Magdalene's misunderstanding was due to her carnal perspective. And he returns to Virgil's claim that the source of emotions was the body, and as such, the origin of evil and sin. Next slide. Then he engages with Stoic philosophers, who also claimed that these passions or perturbations derived from the body. And some Stoics believed that in the pursuit of good, these emotions, desire, joy, and fear, will be replaced by more rational mental states, will, gladness, and caution. I believe you skipped over one slide, but that's no problem. Just go on to the next slide. No, I'm sorry, go back one, backwards. Back again. Thank you. So this notion falls under the term apatheia, which can be translated to English as a mental state of equanimity. Yet Stoic philosophers had different conceptions about what apatheia entailed. And Augustine seems to be criticizing those Stoics who saw apatheia as meaning emotionless. And he refers to this treatment of apatheia in Book 9 of the City of God, in which he stated that the goal of apatheia was not just maintained by Stoics, but also by Aristotelians as well as Platonists, which would automatically include Celsus and Porphyry. Next slide. Augustine's first point of critique here is that these philosophers failed to sufficiently address distress, pain, or grief, because the Stoics claimed that a wise man did not experience these. And in order to replace grief, they posited there was nothing, apatheia. Augustine corrects them by saying, all these emotions, desire, joy, and fear, are common to both good and bad people. But the good feel these emotions in a good way. The bad feel them in a bad way, just as an act of will may be rightly or wrongly directed. Next slide. Then he argues that grief and sadness in the Christian context can have a positive significance. Grief and sadness are often a result of recognizing one's faults or sins, and this engenders repentance. And this attitude is an effect of living according to God's standards and not to human standards. He continues. Yes, it's good. I'm quoting him. Among Christians, the citizens of the holy city of God, as they live by God's standards, in the pilgrimage of this present life, they feel fear, desire, pain, and gladness in accordance with sound doctrine and divine scripture. And because their love is right, all feelings are right in them. Next slide, please. Then he discusses Jesus' emotions. When the Lord himself, completely free from sin, displayed these feelings, he displayed them in situations where he decided that they should be shown. For human emotion was not illusory in him who had a truly human body and a truly human mind. And so, when these feelings are ascribed to Jesus in the gospel, there's certainly no falsehood in them. So in stating here that Jesus' human emotions were not illusory, Augustine must have been thinking of Celsus' critique of Mary Magdalene, that she had been deluded in her emotional state of hysteria and saw a hallucination instead of Christ really being resurrected. Next slide. And then Augustine makes an important distinction, which would apply to Mary Magdalene's tears. I quote, "The emotions we experience, even when they are right and as God would have them, are emotions which belong to this life, not to the life we hope for in the future. And often we give in to them, even against our will. Sometimes we weep, even when we don't want to, though we may be moved, not by any blameworthy desire, but a praiseworthy charity. And that implies that we have these emotions as a result of the weakness of the human condition. But this was not true of Jesus, whose weakness resulted from his power." Next slide, please. And then Augustine underscores his already expressed critique of Stoic apatheia. I quote, "Yet if we felt none of these emotions at all, why we were subject to the emotions in this life, there would really be something wrong with our life." So here he states in no uncertain terms that the state of apatheia could include lack of compassion, which is highly undesirable for Christians. However, Augustine doesn't scoff the state of apatheia entirely. Instead, he claims that it pertains to only the most godly and holy. The state of apatheia will not come until there is no sin in man. It will not come in this present life. So essentially, Augustine is accusing the philosophers who believe they can maintain an emotionless state of mind. And they're remote from the truth, he says, and guilty of arrogance, and even stronger, having been influenced by the devil, a claim reserved specifically for Porphyry in Book 10. Next slide, please. And I'm going to conclude. When we look at Porphyry and Celsus' critique of Mary Magdalene, we could say it struck a sensitive nerve in Augustine, which set off a storm of doctrinal apologies. Because for Augustine, Mary Magdalene's conversion is exemplary for understanding the mysteries of Christ. The story of Mary Magdalene and her tears demonstrated for him that sadness had deep meaning, and it can even engender joy. The story of Mary Magdalene teaches us the importance of emotions, which is fundamental for being able to move forward on our spiritual journey in this life. Thank you, and next slide. Go to change.
Thank you, Laela. Thank you very much. Well, we have no problem with the slides, fortunately. Well, now we open the space to some questions, interventions. Abrimos el espacio para preguntas, intervenciones. Tiene mucho contacto con lo que ayer Paul Van Gies y otros presentadores durante el día nos estuvieron hablando sobre este texto de Juan 20. Perdón, Ramón creo que tiene levantada la mano. Sí, Ramón, ¿querés prender el micrófono y hacer la pregunta, la intervención?
No, realmente no, simplemente estaba aplaudiendo a la magnífica
perdón, yo vi
presentación que
mal.
ha hecho.
Eran los aplausos.
Muchísimas gracias.
Bien, quienes gusten. No sean tímidos. Don't be shy. Here, Mariano puts, thank you very much, Lele. Marian, ¿querés preguntar? Sí, por favor.
Sí, muchas gracias por la presentación. Sí, puse mal el nombre, perdón por tipear rápido. No, me parece muy interesante el tema de las emociones como elemento no que impiden, sino que permiten la unión mística. Me parece en comparación con, por ejemplo, bueno, lo remarcó muy bien con Porfirio y Celsus, pero también con Plotino, por ejemplo, que Plotino constantemente, como es clásico en los platónicos, que hay que abandonar las emociones. Así que me pareció, simplemente un comentario, eso me pareció muy interesante. Y si ella, bueno, si hay algún elemento en Agustín que destaque las emociones como camino utilizado para la unión mística, digamos, no que que la patella se consigue después, una vez, digamos, en el estado de gracia. Muchas gracias. I can ask in English if you prefer, sorry.
That's good, yeah, for the others as well. I understood what you just said, but you can ask again.
Okay. I said that I found really interesting the use of the motions to achieve the Union Mystica in Augustine, in the contrary of what Plotinus thinks and the rest of the Platonists, that we have first to devoid us from emotions, to be emotionless, to achieve this goal. So I ask if Laela found in Augustine something that some path that use emotions in order to achieve this union mystica. Thank you.
I think what you can see the most prominent in Augustine is his use of desire. And that was included in one of the emotions which the Stoics, the most radical Stoics, felt like even desires, any movement in your spirit proves that you're a fool. The best way to exist in your daily life is to have this equanimity, this kind of equal state of mind. But I think in other works of Augustine, we see also not just the Confessions, but also De Trinitate, where desire and love actually push, they're used as an impulse to push you up. And while while you are loving God, let's say the experience of that's kind of indescribable experience of encountering God and experiencing love, that's kind of that's the inroad, that's the channel to God, and that by experiencing that you will love others just by nature. But I'd like to say Plotinus was also had that idea very prominent in his philosophy, which I dealt with in my book, about from the eros. The eros was very prominent in as an impulse, a desire, which actually by Plotinus, which began by physical perception of something beautiful. You see something beautiful and you fall in love with it, as it were, and it makes you very a state of unrest, so that you want to go to the source of this, that beauty and that love. And you see that in Augustine as well. And that beauty and love actually is something that's radiated from the Godhead itself, which you are tuning into and becoming one with, as it were. And we do see that in Augustine quite prominently as well.
Yes, thank you. Because, sorry, just because in Plotinus we achieve just a certain level with the reason, with the intellect, and then we have to add love in order to find to achieve the final union mystica. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Gracias, Mariano. ¿Alguien más que quiera participar? ¿Preguntar? Laela, I have, while we wait for another intervention, I'm really surprised with this analysis about Mary Magdalene tears, because I work with the Gospels, and in the other passion narratives, women don't weep. Even at the sepulchre, no, when they go to the tomb, they don't weep. Just John says that Mary weep. In the others, they are frightened. They are with fear, devotional fear, in front of the angels. But for me, it's interesting. No, in the fourth gospel, Mary cries. I think it's a sign, no? It's well, it's the latest of the Gospels, but of Jesus, there are a lot of indications of his emotions in Mark, in Luke, in John. This seems to me really interesting, no? Augustine is it's the same. I said yesterday to Paul, no, it's more human, no? He allows emotions because Jesus had emotions. No, that's right. And my question is about Mary's profession as prostitute, because I thought that it was a confusion that emerged in 6th century, but Porphyry says that she was a prostitute, and Augustine thought that he knows that how he treats Mary, Mary's sin previously.
Well, to be truthful, the quotes which I'm using here in my paper, they come from a certain source called Macarius, and that was from the middle of the 4th century. These quotes are disputed as to whether they're really from Celsus and Porphyry, because if you look at my English on my slides, they're not so, they seem to be paraphrased. It's very simple. It seems to be very simple language, and Porphyry and Celsus didn't write in simple language. Yet there are people that believe, there are researchers that believe this probably was Porphyry who was being referred to here, and actually other aspects about well, he says that, for instance, I don't have anything specifically to say about the prostitute, but about the being possessed by 7 demons.
Yeah.
That's Augustine thinks that as well. So that part of it being very negative, he doesn't really say much about it, but he also says she was possessed by 7 demons, as if she had a past which was very obscure and shadowy, and when she, her conversion was on various levels, maybe earlier in her life. He doesn't mention that, but I'm just assuming. I'm assuming that he believed that as well to some extent.
That's right.
And
That's right. So these 7 demons could be a lot of kind of things, of sins.
Yeah, but he doesn't mention this in the homilies.
Yeah.
But something which I thought was very striking was that he doesn't say Mary Magdalene was a sinner. She didn't, in her conversion in John 20, she was not a sinner. She was already, as I assume, this is my interpretation, she was already living to the standards of God by turning to Christ. And then experiencing that an incredibly uncanny moment of saying, oh, and the pennies drop. That's Christ. That's so I think Augustine picked up on that extremely important moment in the scriptures with Mary Magdalene, and he exploited it to his own promoting emotions as being very healthy.
That's right. The good direction of emotions.
Yeah, which is the right conversion.
Conversion.
Yeah.
Thank you, Laela. Another answer, intervention. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Mariano, ¿querés participar de nuevo? ¿O dejaste la mano? No más. Bien,
Sorry.
invitamos. Si alguien quiere escribir, no hay ningún problema. Traducimos.
Could I say something else? I'm sorry, I'm talking all the time. I would like to give someone else a chance, but about what you just said, the difference of John, when you read John 20 very carefully, you see how he doesn't, Mary Magdalene first doesn't recognize Jesus. She thinks he's the gardener. And then Christ says, Mary. And then Mary says, oh, Master, Rabboni. And then he goes directly to, don't touch me. And he doesn't really describe the feelings involved in that moment, which I thought was interesting because Augustine put that into his interpretation. And I don't know if anyone else has any ideas or insights about how John represented Mary Magdalene, but Augustine really, there's really no description of what the atmosphere was. Was Mary Magdalene still sad when she noticed, oh, that's Christ? Or was she puzzled? Or what was the emotion at that moment? That was, I thought, maybe someone would like to comment on that.
That's right. That's right. John is very emotional. Not Jesus weeping in Lazarus' tomb. It's surprising, no? And the name of the rose says that he wept, but he didn't laugh. So that's true. Umberto Eco said it's a controversy. No, Jesus laughed really, and for that many people was killed. So Mariano.
Yes, sorry, but I'm sorry to disturb you, Mariano, but
no.
In Gnostic,
that I was thinking of that.
Jesus laughed.
Yeah. En los textos gnósticos Jesús sí se ríe. That's right. Perdón. Viviana pone excelente conferencia. Gracias,
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. So, if is there another question? If not, we close this this conference. Si hay alguna pregunta más, anímense a participar. Laela con gusto responde. Si algo les llamó la atención, detalles, lo que sea, lo que puedan aportar. Bien, bueno, vamos a cerrar entonces la conferencia. Laela, thank you very much for your time.
It was
Gracias.
my
Muchas
pleasure,
gracias.
very much. Muchas gracias,
Formidable,
Pablo.
formidable, formidable.
Muchas gracias.
Ya hablaremos con tiempo.